Thank you, Sarah. Appreciate the playing this morning. Thank you, folks. Good singing this morning. Good spirit. Enjoyed that. Well, let's take our Bibles, shall we? We'll have you turn to Hebrews chapter 11 once again. Hebrews chapter 11. Our journey through this chapter, looking at heroes of faith, takes us now to Moses. We're going to take 2 weeks to cover Moses. And this morning, we're going to look at verses 24 through 26, which really focuses on the choices that Moses made. And so we've titled this message, Moses Choosing by Faith. We all have to make choices in life. Oftentimes, these choices can result in some significant consequences, either good or bad. A lot of decisions we make, a lot of choices we make probably aren't all that important, but some can certainly be life-changing. And as you look back over a lifetime of choices, you may have some that kind of stand out to you that may have been the wrong choice and perhaps leave you with a little bit of regret. Now, ladies, don't look at your husbands right now, or you can look, but don't point, at least. But we all have those choices in our past, those decisions we made in our past that perhaps were not the best. So I want to just give a few examples of other choices made that may encourage you a little bit as you think about some of the bad choices that you have made in the past, perhaps not as bad as some of these. In 1938, Joe Shuster and Jerry Siegel sold their rights for a comic book character that they had invented for $130. The character's name, Superman. In 1955, Sam Phillips sold to RCA Victor Records his exclusive contract with a young singer named Elvis Presley and forfeited royalties on more than 1 billion records. And then in the 1870s, William Orton, Western Union's president and majority owner of the Telegraph, turned down Alexander Graham Bell's offer to purchase the patent on his new invention, the telephone. After all, the telegraph was here to stay. Bad choices, for certain. And sometimes the difference between success and failure comes down to the matter of our choices. And that brings us here to our next great example of faith, Moses. Moses is commended here for the choices that he made. And faith will always make itself known through its choices. Having grown up in the palace of Pharaoh, the time came when Moses was confronted with a difficult choice. Would he hold on to his position of influence and wealth in the Egyptian court, or would he take his place with the enslaved people of God? What it really came down to for Moses was a choice between eternal values or temporal values. Now, not all decisions, choices that we make are that crucial or bear that much weight, but certainly many do. We make choices on a regular basis that will say a lot about whether or not we are choosing eternal values or whether we are choosing temporal values. And when considered in that way, what Moses experienced is common to all believers today. Let's look at the text. 23 through 26 is where we see Moses making the choices that he made. Verse 23 begins the account of Moses' life and really deals more with the parents and the choice that they made. We won't spend time on verse 23, but I do want to begin there by reading there, and we'll read through verse 26. So Hebrews 11, verse 23, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents, because they saw he was a proper child, and they were not afraid of the king's commandment. By faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. So we consider this morning the faith of Moses as being demonstrated in the choices that he made. And so we begin with that as our first main point here this morning, and that is a faith that embraced eternal values. Moses sets an example here of one who made choices based on eternal values. Now, verses 24 through 26, there's a lot of history that's packed there into those verses, but they do reveal some things about the decisions that Moses made and how those decisions truly did reveal his values, that he was making choices based on eternal values rather than temporal values. So let's note how we can see this taking shape in the three decisions, the three choices that Moses makes here in these verses. All right, number one, we see that faith values God's mission above the world's prestige. Faith values God's mission above the world's prestige. Moses certainly had opportunity for the world's acclaim, the world's prestige. As we see it again noting in verse 24, by faith, Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Now that statement there, he refused to become the son of Pharaoh's daughter. It certainly indicates to us the opportunity that was presented to Moses. Now we don't know a lot about his time in the palace. The account in Exodus simply says, and the child grew. That's about all we know from the Old Testament record from the book of Exodus. We do get a little bit more information from Stephen's defense in Acts chapter 7. Not a lot more, but a little bit. Let me read the verse. Stephen, as you know, has been accused of blaspheming the temple and the law. And so before he's stoned, he goes into this long explanation of why he preaches the things that he preaches. And he goes back through a lot of Old Testament history. And a lot of time is spent on Moses. If he's being accused of blaspheming the law, it would make sense that he would spend a lot of time talking about Moses. And he makes this statement in Acts 7:22. He says, and Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and in deeds. So that's about all the information we have about Moses and his time in the palace. According to some traditions, Pharaoh had no sons, and perhaps Moses even stood in line as one who would ascend to the throne. That's possible, but by no means certain. But what is certain is that Moses was aligned very closely with the royal house in an age when royalty was next to divinity. As such, he had phenomenal power, exaltation. All of that would be his, and perhaps even was his for that time being where he lived there, when he lived there in the palace. Egypt was the most cultured and advanced society of that day. And as Stephen is saying there, Moses was steeped in the culture of Egypt, having grown up learning and being able to gain great wisdom. He became mighty in his deeds through the opportunities that Egypt had afforded him. So he had great opportunity to become highly skilled, highly educated. In other words, certainly the world held out many great opportunities for Moses there in Egypt. But we also notice here now the decision that Moses made. Again, we note he refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. A couple of things that I want to make note of concerning that. First of all, Moses' choice of faith was carefully considered. The passage here tells us, again, by faith, Moses, when he was come to years. Stephen tells us in the next verse in Acts 7 that he was 40 years of age when he made this decision, that he was going to renounce the prestige of Egypt, leave that, and pursue what God had for him instead. So he was 40 years of age. He had spent 40 years in the palace, growing up in the palace. He had spent his youth, his young adulthood, experiencing the prestige and all that the palace had to offer and Egyptian culture had to offer him. So what I'm suggesting here is that he had opportunity to weigh things out. The decision he arrives at had been something that certainly had been carefully considered. He had weighed the scales. He had consumed all that Egyptian culture had to offer him. And I think perhaps over the course of that time, he began to realize that it's all pretty much empty, that none of this really does satisfy. And he had carefully considered that which Egypt held out to him, even realizing it's not something that is truly satisfying or fulfilling. And then he was able to consider what would be the alternative if he was to leave that behind and pursue what God instead was calling him to do. So he had seen plenty. He had experienced enough of what the world had to offer, and yet he decided to reject it. His choice of faith had been carefully considered. It wasn't spur of the moment. It was weighed out. It was considered, and he made a rational decision as a mature young man at 40 years of age to make that choice. And second, Moses' choice of faith was determined by God's calling. Now again, it's not something we can ascertain necessarily so much from the account in Exodus, but I think Stephen again gives us a little insight here. Let me go back to that passage in Acts 7, and I'll just continue reading on here with the next verse. I read verse 22, 23. Stephen mentions he was 40 years of age, and when it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. And he says this in verse 24, "And seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended him and avenged him that was oppressed. He smote the Egyptian, for he supposed his brethren would have understood how that God by his hand would deliver them. But they understood not." Obviously, Moses knew something deep down within him, that this was God's calling in his life. This was God's purpose for him, that God had led him to this place. He thought it would be well known enough that even his brethren, the other Israelites there in captivity in Egypt, would also recognize that. But they didn't. But the point being, what Stephen is expressing to us here is that clearly Moses was aware of God's call upon his life, that he had been entrusted by God with a mission, and it was time for that mission to be fulfilled. And the point I want to make here, the point of application for us, is simply this: saying yes to God and his mission will always mean saying no to what the world offers. And there's the rub for, I think, far too many Christians. They can't or they won't let go of the things of this world. I think some want to play it both ways. They want to both have, God, serve him, but yet they want to hold on to this world and serve the things of this world, of this life. But Jesus had very pointedly said, no one can serve two masters. You either hate the one and love the other, or you're going to love the other and hate the other. There's always a choice to make. When we are on God's mission, if we are going to be fully serving him and engaged in what he wants of us, then there are things that we are going to have to say no to and turn our backs on. And that's why faith is vital. We need to believe that God's mission is far better than anything this world offers us, and certainly the prestige and the acclaim of this world, which is so fleeting anyway. The world applauds one moment and they turn on us the next. And all it takes is the tide to change a little bit. Look at what's going on in Hollywood, right? These individuals in Hollywood who had the world's acclaim, who had it all going their way, power, money, prestige. What happens when some things begin to creep out in their lives? All of a sudden, everything changes. The acclaim, the praise, the prestige, all of it turns, and it's gone. It's so fleeting. And yet, so many will invest themselves in trying to obtain the prestige of this world, the love of this world, the affection of this world, not realizing that it's empty. It doesn't satisfy. Moses understood that. Moses got a hold of that truth, and it consumed his heart. And he decided that God's mission was far more valuable to him, far more worthy of pursuing than the world's prestige. Number two, we see next as we go on that faith values God's purpose above the world's pleasures. Faith values God's purpose above the world's pleasures. Going on, looking at verse 25, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. A couple of things here, and I want you to note with me. Number one, God's purpose always includes momentary occasions of affliction. God has purposed affliction, suffering in the lives of his people. That's always a part of God's purpose for us. In order for God to do with us as he desires to do, in order for God to make us into the kind of people he wants us to become, there must be pain. There must be affliction. And when Moses chose to identify with God's people, a despised and persecuted people, Moses was choosing affliction. And I believe Moses knew that full well. You see, Moses didn't go from pleasure to less pleasure, or even pleasure to no pleasure. Moses went from pleasure to pain. You know, if it wasn't such a huge contrast between God's way and the world's way, it'd be so much easier for us to live for the Lord, wouldn't it? But there is such a contrast, and it's a huge contrast. The world's way is always a way of self-indulgence and pleasure. God's way is always a way of self-sacrifice and pain. And once again, far too many Christians, I fear, don't want to choose that way. They would rather avoid sacrifice. They would rather avoid pain, avoid affliction. And yes, we don't embrace it, we don't love it, but yet for the one who is sold out to Jesus Christ understands that's a part of the process. It's a necessary part of the process. And so we don't look for the easy way. We don't look for ways that we can kind of skirt around and shortcut the path that God has set out for us. Peter tells his readers, don't be surprised by the fiery trial that comes and tries you, as though some strange thing has happened to you. Jesus certainly made it very clear all that we're getting ourselves into when we choose to follow him. He talks about putting your hand to the plow and not looking back. He talks about picking up a cross, bearing that cross. He talks about how in this world we will have tribulation. Certainly ought not to surprise us when affliction comes, when suffering comes. We need to accept the fact that when we choose to follow Christ, we're choosing a path of affliction. Secondly, we note that God's purpose always outweighs the momentary pleasures of sin. God's purpose always includes momentary affliction. And it is momentary. Paul says this affliction, these trials are but for a moment, working for us a far more exceeding eternal weight of glory. They're momentary afflictions, doing in us an eternal work. And so God's purpose always outweighs the momentary pleasures of sin. Now, what pleasures did Moses reject? Again, looking at the text, it says he chose to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. Well, certainly living in Pharaoh's household. He would have had the best food always available. He would wear the nicest, newest clothes, certainly. He had wealth to buy anything that he wanted. The thought occurred to me as I was preparing this of the people of Israel as they're complaining in the wilderness. They began to grumble. Remember how things were in Egypt and how they wanted to go back to the way things used to be? What did they give as their fond memories of Egypt? Well, we had fish sandwiches, and we had onion and leek soup. Now we're out in this desert. We're starving to death. We want to go back to the good life that we had back in Egypt. It occurred to me, why didn't Moses say to them, you know what? You want to talk about the way things used to be? Let's compare notes. Let me tell you about what I left in Egypt. You talk about your fish sandwiches from McDonald's. I had the finest steaks from Big Hoss's Steakhouse whenever I wanted them. I mean, he could have set them straight about what it is to leave behind a glamorous lifestyle, a profitable lifestyle. But he didn't do that. Never mentions what he had in Egypt, how much he had left behind when he made the decision to leave Egypt and to align himself with the people of God. And I was reminded again of the verse we had noted last week in our message on Abraham, and also in reference to his son and grandson Isaac and Jacob, back up in verse 15. Again, such a great spiritual principle here that I think it bears hitting again. And truly, if they had been mindful of that country from whence they came out, they might have had opportunity to have returned. Speaking of Abraham, if he had longed for his home from where he had been called out, his father's house, his former country, if he had longed for that, it would have been easy for him to go back to that. And the same principle applies, at least in part, to Moses here. Why didn't Moses compare notes with the people of Israel? Why didn't he say to them, well, you know what, let me tell you about how good I had it in Egypt. Now, you talk about how good you had it, which wasn't true, by the way, as you know. They were slaves in Egypt. They forgot all that. But Moses could have certainly said to them, let me tell you some things about what life was like for me in Egypt. He didn't do that. Why not? Because I think for Moses, that part of his life was done. He wasn't holding on to that with any hint of affection. Now, certainly, unlike with Abraham, Moses was not going back. That bridge was burned when he killed an Egyptian and Pharaoh wanted his life. And then there's that whole Red Sea thing where the armies of Pharaoh all drowned in the Red Sea. Yeah, Moses wasn't going back to Egypt. I understand that. But you know what? The people of Israel weren't going back either. I mean, how's that going to go over? They walk back into Egypt, and the Egyptians say to them, hey, weren't you associated with the Red Sea and the armies being drowned? And yeah, that was us. Well, hey, welcome back. Yeah, I don't think so. They were not going back to Egypt. They knew that. Moses wasn't going back to Egypt either. But for the people of Israel, they were still holding on to that with affection. They were looking back at the way things were and thinking somehow, that was a glamorous life, that had something to offer them that what they're experiencing now doesn't hold up to, doesn't compare to. And they got their affections were all messed up. I think for Moses, he had put that totally out of his heart, totally out of his mind. There was no thought, no desire, no inkling that he would ever want to go back to that. No matter how difficult things were in the present for Moses. Struggling in the wilderness with a bunch of complaining people, still he knew that being in the center of God's will, suffering, enduring affliction, all of that was far better than anything he had left behind. It's a matter of the heart. You see, and when we hold on to the things of the world in our hearts, there's always that longing to go back. And probably for most Christians, there is no going back. You know that. The friendships you had, they're gone. There isn't even the possibility of going back. But yet, for some, the longing is still there. The desire is still there. And that's what needs to be dealt with. Set your affection on things above, Paul tells us, not on the things of this earth. And as long as our affections are in the past, as long as our affections are on the world, we'll never be content in the present. We'll never be of use to God. So Moses doesn't compare notes with the people of Israel. Moses doesn't bring up the past to them and say to them, oh yeah, let me tell you. He doesn't do that because he's long forgotten that. He has no affection, no interest in the things of the past. God's purpose always outweighs the momentary pleasures of sin, and Moses was well aware of that. Now, he had all these things to enjoy there in Egypt, but in what way are those things sin? He had all good food, rich food. He had nice clothes, lots of money to spend any way he want. How is that sin? Well, those things in and of themselves, of course, are not necessarily sin, but if they keep us from doing the will of God, if they keep us from fulfilling His purpose in our life, then they become sin. And of course, anytime we overindulge in things of that nature, it becomes sin. Moses, the point here is Moses had to renounce those things. He had to break ties with those things completely. And if they held him back, if those things became too great for him, that he loved those things too much to where he couldn't renounce them and walk away from them, then obviously, clearly, those things would have become sin for him. And so it leads us to conclude that anything that hinders God's purpose in our lives becomes sin to us. It may just be momentary pleasure, or it may just bring us momentary pleasure. But fulfilling God's purpose always outweighs that momentary pleasure that anything sin might produce. So Moses shows us a faith that embraces eternal values by the way in which he chooses God's mission above the world's prestige. He chooses God's purpose above the world's pleasure. And then third, we see how for Moses, faith values God's reward above the world's prosperity. Above the world's prosperity. Verse 26, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. Now, Egypt was a nation of vast wealth, a wealth that Moses certainly could have enjoyed for the rest of his life if he had chose to stay there. But like the world's pleasure and like the world's prestige, Moses rejected it. A couple of things here we'll make mention of. First of all, we see that God's reward is centered in the person of Jesus. I find this statement fascinating concerning Moses. Verse 26, again, it says, he esteemed the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt. And it led me to wonder, obviously, well, how much of Christ did Moses know? And the commentaries weren't particularly very helpful because there really isn't any real answer. We don't know how much knowledge Moses had of Christ, of the Messiah. Clearly he had some. I don't think the author here is just saying this kind of after the fact. Well, now we look back and we see that Moses endured the reproach of Christ. No, I think there's more to it. I think Moses had some understanding of the coming Messiah, being the anointed one, the Christ. He certainly was aware of the promise that God had made to Eve, that through her one would come who would crush the head of the serpent. He was aware of the sacrificial system that was already in place, the blood being shed of an innocent animal to provide a covering for sin. He knew of the experience of Abraham there on Mount Moriah, where God provided a substitute for the life of his son. Now, certainly there would be progressive revelation for Moses. He would learn more as things went along, as he received the law, as he received more detail of the sacrificial system, as the tabernacle came into being. And so there would be ongoing revelation and a greater understanding of these things. But I think even initially for Moses, there was some understanding, a realizing that by his breaking with Egypt and identifying with the people of God, he was truly, in essence, identifying with the Messiah of God, the Anointed One, the Christ. He chose to identify because God's reward, his ultimate reward, is always centered in the person of Jesus. He considered that any reproach he endured as he identified with God's Messiah was far more valuable than the worldly treasures that would be offered him in Egypt. And folks, we need to get a hold of that same spiritual truth, that by identifying with Christ and the affliction, the persecution, whatever we endure as we serve Christ, as we put him first in our lives, whatever we give up, whatever reproach we bear, it's always worthy. When we treasure Christ, the luster of this world will always fade in comparison. And I fear perhaps that God's people simply don't treasure Christ enough. We value too much of what this world offers us, and we don't truly in our hearts treasure and value Christ above all things. Because if we do, I think we would endure far more. If we did truly value Christ, I think we would serve a little more. I think we would be maybe a little more faithful. We must value Christ above all else because all that God offers, all that he has, is centered in the person of Christ. And then also, we see here that God's reward is eternal in heaven. He esteemed the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. Or in other words, he was looking to the reward. That's the idea there. He was looking to the reward. He endured the reproach because he was looking to the reward. He knew that it was not going to be coming in this life, but he knew it would be given in the next. And the reward of being with Jesus in heaven is always far greater than any earthly reward. Faith always banks on eternity. Moses knew he was gaining something of much greater value than all the treasures of Egypt by bearing the reproach of Christ. All that Egypt had to offer was nothing in comparison with what awaited him. You look at Moses and we see the choices he made based on eternal values and temporal values. You may say, well, I don't have that many choices, that many decisions to make that really bear the weight of those kind of consequences. To which I would reply, oh yes you do. You make choices frequently that truly determine whether or not you are basing that choice on eternal value or temporal value. When you make the choice to stay home on Sunday morning because you want to sleep an extra hour, or you just want a day off, or you just want to be able to relax, and when you make that choice, you are making a choice based on temporal value rather than eternal value. When you make the choice that you're not going to get involved in church, you're not going to use your spiritual gifts to serve the body of Christ because it's just too demanding, it would take too much time, you've got other things that you need to be doing. When you make that choice, you are making a decision based upon temporal values rather than eternal values. The fact of the matter is, we all do it frequently. We make those kinds of decisions. We don't oftentimes look at it that way. It's just a Sunday morning, not a big deal. It's not that big of a deal, but somebody else will do that ministry if I don't do it. And we just kind of minimize our decisions not to get involved, not to be faithful, not fully comprehending, realizing we're making a choice based on eternal values or temporal values. And far too often, we are making that based on the temporal. We want momentary pleasure, momentary ease, momentary comfort, rather than doing something, committing ourselves to something that's going to involve a little bit of time, a little bit of sacrifice, going to take away from the other things we want to do, and we're making the decisions based on the temporal. We need to look to Moses and see that only by faith can we make the right choice time and time again. Because those temporary choices produce some temporary pleasure. It may not even necessarily be sin, but they're pleasurable. A little time off, little bit of more money for us to spend, a little more able to enjoy some of the finer things, what have you. It may not necessarily be sin in and of itself, unless we're robbing God to do those things. But by faith, we realize that the choices we make based on eternal values are going to pay rich dividends in the end. Maybe a little bit of suffering now, maybe a little bit of difficulty, a little bit of sacrifice, a little bit of struggle, but in the end, it's going to be worth it. And faith holds on to that. Moses made 3 decisions by faith, and these 3 choices made all the difference for him. It made him the leader of God's people. It made him the giver of the law. It made him the leader of the nation of Israel. It made him a forerunner to Christ, who God said there's going to be a prophet who's going to come who's just like you. All of this was what Moses was able to receive by the choices that he made. If he had stayed in Egypt, he would have died in obscurity. Yeah, would have had a fine life, I'm sure, but he would have died in obscurity. And here we are talking about him thousands of years later because he made the choices that he made. We can all make a lot of bad decisions over the course of a lifetime. But when we have to choose between the eternal and the temporal, we can never go wrong when we choose the eternal. Never. Which are you choosing? See, the choices, whether we realize it or not, are clear. Choose wisely. Choose eternal values. I tell you, you'll never regret it. You'll never regret it. Let's pray. Father, I pray you challenge us this morning as we see from the example of Moses, a man who made choices based on the eternal. Father, I pray that we would do the same. That when we make our decisions, when we decide whether or not we're going to be faithful to church, when we decide whether or not we're going to get involved and serve, and whether we decide if we're going to give, or all of these decisions really come down to matters of the eternal or the temporal. Father, may we choose the eternal. May we choose wisely, knowing that there's a reward for us when we do this. May we see it by faith. May we claim it by faith. May we bear the reproach, knowing that it works for us an eternal weight of glory. Father, challenge us. Even as you challenge my own heart, may you challenge each and every one of us by your Spirit through the Word today. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.